right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Practicing Imperfection podcast. This podcast is a personal inquiry into whole humanness, intentional leadership, and a space for me to touch on some of the dualities we face every day in this world. My hope for you is that each week you walk away feeling one of two ways. Either you feel seen, heard, and validated in ways you haven't before, or you feel challenged and intrigued to view life, people, and/or experiences in a different way than you did before tuning in. Wherever you fall, I hope that you take these next few minutes or a few minutes every week to commit to contemplation and growth. And now I'm excited to get started. But before I dive into today's topic, just a few quick reminders. The last episode on the Practicing Imperfection podcast talked a lot about embodiment. If you're interested in learning more about what this concept looks like in practice, join me on April 20th at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time for an embodiment workshop. A link will be in the show notes to register, or if you're listening to this after the live workshop has taken place, check the show notes for a link to the recording. Second reminder is, as we're talking about in the podcast, and as we've talked about before about vision and values, you may be rethinking your own. And if reevaluation of vision, direction, and goals are in order for you, check out my Life Aligned mini course for a 4-week self-guided program on intentional goal setting and a first step to charting a sustainable path forward toward your ideal envisioned life. As always, one-on-one coaching slots come available occasionally, so get on my email list if you'd like to be the first to know about that. And if you are interested in setting up a discovery call, the link will also be in the show notes for that. And with that, let's get on with today's topic. Today, we are talking about knowing self and active intentional leadership. So last week, we talked about my personal value of understanding self. I talked a lot about why this is important for you to be able to design the life that you want to live. It's important for you to be able to create safe and loving and functional relationships with others. And it's a crucial part of having a healthy relationship with yourself. Today, I want to talk about the same idea, the importance of understanding self, but through a slightly different lens and context. This week, we're talking all about leadership. Over the years, I've had a rough and tumble relationship with leadership. I've experienced several leaders who really struggled in their roles, and not because they were bad or not because they were mean or not because they were evil, right? But really because they just didn't truly understand themselves, or because they were in an environment that did not embrace this idea of being a unique human and of not being perfect, right? Of not having every single skill in the book. I also, myself, have both thrived and struggled in my leadership, and it's something that I have kind of wrestled with over the years. What I have seen in reflection, particularly over the last year or so, as I've transitioned away from a formal official leadership position and into my own entrepreneurial leadership position, and a thing that's really sparked curiosity in me is why? Because when I have been at my best as a leader has not always been when I've had the highest title or the most responsibility. What I realized is that it was the moments in time where I had the strongest relationship with myself and my strongest personal confidence, and when I had the strongest relationship with my own personal vision and values. So what I've come to realize is that understanding myself has led me to be a more open and honest about what I can and can't do, right? It's allowed me to be more aware of and more vocal about what I'm good at and what's hard for me, and what I enjoy doing versus what I really don't enjoy doing. We live in a world where we are expected to show up and operate within a job description. And we're expected to have all of the skills, all of the experiences, and be able to do every single thing associated with that job description, right? But that's not realistic. None of us meet 100% of the requirements on a job description. And if you do, you're most likely overqualified for that role. And I'm talking about this in terms of work because I think it's an easy place to really think about leadership. Leadership also obviously shows up in relationships, in family dynamics, in social situations. But for the context of our conversation, I am going to focus mostly on a traditional work environment and how knowing yourself shows up in your leadership there. Understanding myself and my needs has made me more open and compassionate to others. It's helped me have empathy, which I already feel I'm strong at, but it's helped me to act on that empathy. It's also helped me to see people for where they really are each day. And it's helped me to understand them and their needs better as a leader. Based on this reflection of my experiences, I've come to believe that understanding self is truly a foundational piece of building strong leadership. So here's what I believe. In order to be a strong, trustworthy, and effective leader, you have to know, trust, and understand yourself. Being a strong leader requires you to know where you're going, know what you'll need in order to get there, and be able to communicate those needs clearly. If you don't understand yourself, you won't be able to understand your own needs. If you can't understand your own needs and you can't identify those, you're going to have a really hard time trusting yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, then you'll ultimately struggle to make decisions and making those decisions that will ultimately move you in the direction of your goals. In the same sense, if you don't understand yourself, those that you are leading, those that you maybe are in charge of, they're also going to struggle to understand you, right? Because how can we expect others to understand us if we don't understand ourselves? And this will ultimately make it hard for those individuals who are maybe a part of your team or a part of your family or a part of a group that you belong to. It'll make it hard for them to support you and to support the collective goal, vision, etc., that your group or family is aiming for. If you don't trust yourself, how will they trust you? If you don't know yourself, how will they know you? If you don't understand yourself, how can they understand you? If you don't model this self-reflection, vulnerability, and ultimately a willingness to be wrong and seek help, how is it that those around you are supposed to know that it's safe for them to do any of those things themselves? And isn't that ultimately what we're looking for in building strong relationships, strong teams, people who show up fully to an environment? Understanding yourself, trusting yourself, being vulnerable with these things, it all takes unlearning, relearning, and practice. Understanding self is absolutely not a destination. It is a continual process of building trust and understanding, both with yourself and others. And like most things, you may swing too far and too fast in one direction on the pendulum. You may go too far on the pendulum of introspection and vulnerability, and it may scare people. It may scare you, right? It may not kind of show up well in the world. And that's where you'll have to find your way back to this balance of showing vulnerability and practicing curiosity and introspection while also operating in the world that we have today. Finding your way back to that place, swinging too far, it's all okay. It's all part of the process. Understanding self is about building the skill of observing. So in our podcast today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my belief about understanding self from a professional standpoint, as I mentioned. I'm also going to wrap up the podcast today talking about two practices that I want you to take away with you, right? So this idea of observing is one of them, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But understanding self is about building the skill of observing, about being able to take a step back, look around, see where you're out of alignment. It's also about knowing when you've reached your edge, right? It's about knowing your strengths and being able to communicate them along with your needs. And it's about utilizing all of these things in order to build a team or a community around you that can ultimately help you grow and achieve by matching those strengths or complementing them. Understanding self is also about understanding your desires, even and especially when those desires don't, quote unquote, fit with the norm. Learning to hold space for all of the different parts of yourself is a key part of understanding self. Understanding your triggers, the things that light you up, the things that bring you energy, and the things that drain you are all part of knowing and understanding self. And taking all of those things and understanding them will help you to better present yourself to the world in a way that is going to create an environment around you of support and love and understanding. The other part of understanding self is understanding how those around you see and put themselves into the world. How do they see themselves? How do they hold themselves, protect themselves? How do they speak, act, work, react, feel? It is, of course, very hard to see every part of another human. But what parts can you seek to uncover and understand? How can you understand their energy, their needs, triggers, motivations? And, what is it? How can we create a slow and safe space to teach this and learn this about one another, especially when we are in less personal and inherently safe environments, like a work environment? Understanding yourself and all of these things that I've been talking about is really the foundation of leadership, in my opinion, because it gives you the framework for how to look at someone else and start to understand those same things about them. To be a good leader, you have to know people. You have to know needs. You have to see and anticipate needs. You have to see and anticipate fears, as well as see and anticipate strengths and possibility, right? The world we live in and work in and lead in does not allow ample space for these things to happen easily. But curiosity, connection, and caring, along with community, are core to our human nature and the human experience. So accessing these things really shouldn't be this hard, but it is. If you live and work in an environment where it's not safe or encouraged to truly get to know yourself and others, I get it. And that's what I'm working to change. Because this can't be a challenging act in today's world, but it is. So as you're sitting here thinking, okay, cool, I know myself, but I still can't show up to work. It's not a safe environment for me to be vulnerable. It's not a safe environment for me to really care for others and have those kinds of conversations. I hear you. I kind of challenge you to leave that position if you can, find another one. It is, after all, a employee's world out there these days, right? But I understand that that's not always accessible to everyone. That's not always a possibility for everyone. So how do you start to build this sort of environment in your place of work, in the spaces where you show up, without that idea of swinging too far in one direction on the pendulum? So part of this too is you taking away from today's conversation what works for you personally, but also understanding your current environment, your current expectations of leadership, and how to just start picking away at those things, right? You don't have to implement everything all at once. You don't have to, not everything has to be a revolution, right? Some things do, but not everything. And maybe you're not revolutionary, right? Those people have their place in this world and they are important, but they're not all of us. Some of us prefer to work within the systems that we have and slowly dismantle them in line with those that are working to actively dismantle them at a very high rate. In my opinion, our world needs both. I would definitely say I am more of the internal disruptor, the slow dismantler, but I work with a lot of people and I'm very close to a lot of people who are much more radical thinkers, much more revolutionary energies. And I need that in my life, right? But that's not who I am, and that's okay. So I say that all to say, as we step into the next part of our conversation, which is about how do you start to implement some of these things, I'm starting small because that's what works for me. And that's what works for my coaching clients. And that's what works for most people I know who have not yet stepped foot into this world of really deeply understanding themselves. So with that, let's talk a bit about some ways that you can start to practice understanding yourself in order to understand others and lead more effectively. There are two things I want to talk specifically about today and have a little bit of homework for you as you leave this conversation. One is all about observation, and the second is about understanding your strengths. So starting with observation, observing, and when I talk about observing yourself and observing in a broad sense, the world around you, to me, it's all about checking in, seeing how you're feeling, what thoughts you're having, what physical sensations are coming up, all of those sorts of things. And this practice doesn't have to be anything strict or formal, but like embodiment, which I know we discussed in the last episode, checking in and observing yourself is a first step to building empathy, both for yourself and others. I will talk about this a little bit more in my embodiment workshop, but one tip that I have, if you struggle with verbally identifying your feelings, get a feelings wheel. You can get it off the internet for free. You can probably buy one somewhere. I know it might sound silly, but yes, I am going there because not having language is such an extreme barrier when it comes to cultivating understanding and empathy. And yes, I am going to go there. Brene Brown's newest book, y'all. Queen Brene, as we refer to her in my house. Her newest book, Atlas of the Heart, she discusses how having language for our feelings is one of the not having language for our feelings, rather, is one of the number one barriers to connection. And so she literally wrote a whole book, did a whole mess of research on language around feelings. Most people can only name 3 feelings: happy, sad, and maybe scared, I think. I can't remember what the third one is necessarily. There are so many words to describe the human experience, and to narrow it down to those 3, it doesn't allow for connection. It doesn't allow for us to truly see someone and understand them. So I highly encourage you, as you're practicing observing yourself, start practicing using different language with that as well, and seeing how that affects the way that you see your experiences, right? Because if I just say, oh, I'm sad, it doesn't really get at why or what's causing it or what that really feels like or how I feel that in my body. It's just a blanket umbrella of a feeling, right? If we can't observe and name our own feelings, how is it that we expect to be able to observe and understand what others around us might be going through, right? Again, it goes back to that idea of if we don't understand ourselves, how are we supposed to understand others? And how are they supposed to understand us? The same thing comes into play here with this practice of observation and naming our feelings. In order to cultivate understanding and empathy for others in our leadership, we have to start by doing that same act with ourselves. Your homework this week is to observe yourself. When you go to your next meeting or you're in transition between one activity and another, I encourage you to take 30 seconds to take a deep breath, check in, and try to identify and name how you're feeling in that moment. I encourage you to do this throughout the day and maybe record what you were doing and how you were feeling, just to kind of start to see correlations. It's also a great practice as you start to get used to this observation thing to observe your reactions. So you can start by observing your feelings, and next you can start to observe your reactions and start to identify and name those so that you can understand how you show up, right? How you show up in a group dynamic, how you show up to a certain meeting, how you show up to a presentation. What are your physical and mental reactions to those things? And what are they telling you? The second thing I want you to focus on this week, and the second way that I encourage people to practice understanding themselves, is through discovering and understanding your strengths. I mentioned this earlier, and I've probably mentioned it at every podcast that I've done so far, and I probably will mention it for every podcast to come. But for me, spending the last year or so working with my strengths, and particularly the Gallup Clifton StrengthsFinder strengths, has been life-changing. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but it has truly been life-changing for me. In a moment in my career this time last year and in my leadership where I was at my lowest and I felt completely incapable and completely incompetent, my coach really pushed me to get to know my top 10 strengths. Now, if you don't know about Gallup StrengthsFinder, it's a list of 34 strengths that, is based on years and years and years of research, and that everyone kind of has their own order, right? From 1 to 34 of their strengths. You typically look at your top 5 or top 10 as the ones that show up most often in your life, but understanding the full 34 has been really, really interesting for me. And so here are a few things that happened when I started really diving into my strengths and trying to understand how they were, well, one, were actually strengths, and two, how they showed up for me in my life, work, and leadership. So the first thing was that I realized that I, for the most part, was categorizing all of my strengths, so my top 5 strengths, as useless or unimportant or unneeded in my current role or leadership environment. I assumed that everyone had the strengths that I had, and that I was the only one that didn't have the quote unquote right strengths to be a leader in business. And so because I assumed that everyone had the same strengths as me, and that because they weren't particularly what my boss at the time was looking for in this role that I've had, that meant that I was bad at my job. I was unable to perform. And honestly, I really felt hopeless and useless. And so the second thing that happened for me as I started to dive into my strengths is that after some deprogramming around the belief that I was useless, because obviously we had to start there, and this belief of being useless because I didn't have the strengths that I personally deemed to be important in leadership, I started to think about how to maximize my strengths and delegate or ask for help with the things that were not as high on my list. So for a little bit of context, my top 5 Clifton StrengthsFinder strengths, wow, that was a lot of strengths, are connectedness, strategic, activator, ideation, and relator. And now hearing those, that might not mean a lot to you right now unless you've already done work in this area, but there's so much information on this out there. And so in extremely simplified terms, I care about people. I care about how they are and how I can help them improve. I'm a creator. I'm an idea person, and I'm a problem solver who really likes to get the ball rolling and get moving and get started. What I am not is an executor or an implementer or a tracker of accountability. And in looking at those two categories, I saw the what I am not good at, executor, implementer, tracker of accountability, as the only things that you needed to be a leader and to be a good manager and a good boss and all of those things. When in reality, there are excellent leaders and bosses and managers who have all of those skills. There are also really great managers, bosses, and leaders who don't have those as their top skills, right? Because they build a team around them, in theory, that can help to support and complement their strengths. So in fact, which people who've worked with me in the past will not be surprised to hear this and already probably know this, but none of my top 5 or 10 strengths are in the quote doing category or execution category or finishing category. Most of my strengths are in the creation, the starting, the get the ball rolling, the energize people, the convincing, right? I'm a front end person. I am not someone that finishes the process. And that has taken me a year to come to terms with. It's taken me a year to understand that not everyone has that get the ball rolling ideation type strength makeup. And so that's what I bring to the table, right? And although it really did take me some time to accept this and to start to embrace my strengths, once I did, everything in my life started to improve. And again, I'm not trying to be dramatic about this. It's really true that everything in my life started to improve. And now that I understand myself in this way, I'm better prepared to look to my current team or a future team for support. I'm better equipped to be clear about what my needs are in order to spend more time operating in my zone of genius. And if you have not read the book, The Big Leap, which talks about your zone of genius, I highly recommend that. But being able to know my strengths and know my not strengths has allowed me to show up, particularly in my new team environment where I'm building a business with a group of people, to be able to say, hey, everything that I bring to you is going to be a first draft. I need someone else to make it a final draft. If I have to make it a final draft, it will never get done. It will be procrastinated to the end of time, and I will have, or if it does get done, the amount of stress that it will require for me to get it done, it's not going to be worth any of our time and energy. However, I can get you like a 95% of the way there, rough draft. Being able to share that with someone was liberating for me, because now they know I'm not the final draft girl. I'm not the PowerPoint girl, but I am the content. I am the ideas. I am the outline. I can create the strategy. I can create the structure. I'm just not implementing it. Cool. Now, I know that some of this is easier for me in a lot of ways because I am in the entrepreneurial world right now. I am building my own business. But I do really encourage you as part of your homework to get to know your own strengths. It doesn't have to be through StrengthsFinder, but I do highly recommend those. Mainly because Gallup also has a podcast that walks you through every single one of your strengths and everything about it and everything you need to know. But I do encourage you to really dive into this idea of strengths because I want you to see how it helps you show up differently in different environments. I want you to see how releasing this need to be strong in all 34 categories can create freedom for you to really hone in on the strengths that you do have. And I want you to be able to see how understanding your strengths can really help you to verbalize what you need help in and how you need support, right? From a manager or from a partner. Like, hey, this is not me. I don't want to do, it's not even can't, right? I don't want to do these things. Can you help me? Can you compliment me here? Can we find someone who does compliment the work that I do and the way that I show up, right? I hired a coordinator when I was a director because I couldn't handle all the details. I couldn't handle the wrapping up of things along with doing everything else. And I berated myself for so long on that. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, I can just focus on my strengths and someone else can focus on their strengths and we can complement each other. How amazing. What a concept, right? So your homework this week is to observe, it's to get to know your strengths. And as always, I want you to take what resonates with you and leave the rest for another time. Understanding my feelings and acknowledging and working with my strengths has not only changed the way that I show up in life and leadership, it's also changed my level of self-confidence. Instead of trying to be good at things that I'm not inherently good at or pretending to be someone that I'm not, I can now show up and confidently share my strengths while also level setting with others what would be best if to be owned by someone else. I don't have to own everything. I don't have to be perfect at everything to be a good leader. Now, am I perfect at this? Have I completely mastered, not trying to be good at other things that I'm not great at? Of course not. This for me, this study of understanding myself and understanding my strengths and observing, this is one of the ultimate practices of imperfection in my life right now. I will probably be practicing this balance and learning to better understand myself forever. But is there a more meaningful journey than the one toward understanding yourself and how you shine brightest in this world? I think not. So with that, I will leave you for today. I hope that you walk away with a lot of thinking to do and some practices for growing your self-understanding. Again, go forth and take care of yourself. Take some time to go inward. Take some time to fluff your feathers a little bit by understanding your strengths, right? Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful, imperfect, and beautiful week.